Hey everybody, welcome back. So today we're going to talk about group and family assessment, obviously. This is going to be one of those chapters that some of the past few chapters have sort of followed the theme of we're going to take different kinds of assessment and talk about those specifically. The group and family stuff is so wildly different than some of the other things we've talked about, and we're kind of tagging it on at the end, so some of you might be just burned out and tired at this point from so much work and all the lectures and all that kind of stuff. But I also think that this tends to be one of the most important, but also, at least in our program, not highlighted as much as it could be because of the value it can bring to your work with different kinds of people. So hopefully that'll become evident as we get going here. But we're going to talk about this in sort of two different chunks. So first of all, there's group assessment. Many of you are going to facilitate groups of different kinds. There's a lot of stuff in here about group assessment. And then the family assessment is a whole bunch of different stuff that's involved in that. Family assessment, it can be looked at in a couple ways. One of them, if anybody's ever served as a case manager or you've worked with families, with people in sort of counseling settings or, helping settings or whatever, it's one thing to learn about the family and like understand different points of view and different people's perspective on how they view like that one client or something. That's kind of a different thing than what we're talking about. What we're really talking about here is if you've family assessment in the context of systems theory. And if you haven't heard about systems theory, this is going to be a whole bunch of new stuff all at once. If you have, this will probably make a lot of sense. Systems theory in a nutshell, and it's way more deep and rich, and it's got a lot of history because the people who are in the marriage and family therapy profession, that this is really their bread and butter. This is the thing they developed and the thing they're really, really good at. So we're just tagging it on to the end of an assessment class, but it has a whole bunch more to know about it and how it works. But if you've ever heard of structural family therapy, of psychodrama, of narrative therapy, all of these kind of follow the tradition of systems theory. And in a nutshell, what systems theory is it says that every system, both families, communities, like city communities, nations, everybody's got kind of like the way that different parts of the system interact. So we're going to just focus specifically on family systems. So dad and mom, and we'll just say two kids, is kind of the nuclear family. Who people talk to in times of stress, who people talk to when rules have to be established, how people relate to each other in terms of what information they share. It creates these really interesting dynamics. If like, let's say just sort of traditional American family household, dad sets the rules, but he's gone most of the time, so mom really gets to enforce them. So when kids have a challenge or something going on in their life, maybe they go to mom for emotional support, but they go to dad for strength and, I don't know, retribution for the bullies on the playground or something like that. I don't know. But these are like the unspoken rules of how the system operates or how the family operates. So when it comes to assessment, it's a lot about figuring out what are the family rules that are unspoken. What sort of emotional realities exist that play out in the way people relate to each other within that family system. And so family therapy oftentimes is figuring out how does this system work? Who goes to who and why do they go to them, and who's not talking to who because of that and because of that thing that happened that one time. And then when something happens with sister, does the kid go to mom or does the kid go to dad? And how do we reset balance depending on what's going on? Like all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot to explain and talk about. Some of it we'll get into, but just know that we're sort of scratching the surface here. So hopefully when I say family assessment or hopefully when I say family assessment, I'll just leave it at that. What we get is something more than you understood before. It's not just asking the family about like, how are you and what's your history and that kind of stuff. It's more about understanding the unspoken rules that guide the behavior in present day, something like that. Okay, but let's go up here to talk about the things we have to talk about today. Let's talk about group assessment, okay? Reorient yourself back to group assessment. It's one thing to assess individuals in the group on their process and progress. It's another thing entirely to assess how the group collectively functions. Now, coming out of what I just explained about family therapy, take that dynamic of how people relate to each other within the group and apply that to just strangers, essentially. It's slightly different because families and groups just function a little bit different, but that's kind of what we're going to talk about is for group therapy to work, I've been a part of groups where there's been a facilitator who really gets people connected and gets people working together, and then essentially just sits back and watches the show and lets people do their stuff once they understand the process of how group is supposed to function. But I've also seen people who, they get in a group of people, they do check-ins one-on-one, and the facilitator talks to each individual, and it's essentially just like very short, brief, back-to-back individual sessions, and they don't really benefit from the value of being together as a group. So the question is, what makes groups work? How do you know when it's working? How do you know when it's not working? Sometimes we can kind of feel it and use our intuition. It seems like something's going on, but we really want to figure out what are the group dynamics so we know if a group is not quite working well enough because there's conflict or something. How do we get them beyond that by knowing what it's supposed to look like and identifying problem areas? That's really what we're going to be kind of focusing on here. Now, there's another caveat to that. Now, I'm finally getting around to my first bullet point. Hopefully this is not an indication of how long it's going to be today, but it might be. The caveat of that is there's lots of different kinds of groups. Support groups, couples groups where multiple couples get together and they talk about their own individual issues, but in the context of the support of other people. There are diagnosis-related groups, like a group for anger, a group for borderline personality, a group for grieving parents, or whatever the thing is. So that's related to their condition. There are groups for behavior modifications, and the participants might have all different behaviors, but they're all working on something like that. Personality training, educational groups, etc. There's lots of different kinds of scenarios. So when we talk about these various things here, we want to take into consideration how many different kinds of group settings and dynamics there really can be. So we're looking for high-level suggestions or things that I can talk to you about that could apply to all of those in context. So now the second point here, individual assessments are often used and results may or may not be shared with the group. What that basically means is even in a group setting, yes, there's an assessment of group process and group dynamics like I just said. But if you're doing a group for, I don't know, let's say a college stress relief group or something like that. So people are coming from different majors. They're coming from different years, so freshman through senior, and so people are going to be in different places. In that context, you can still give people the same Beck's depression inventory or the PHQ-9 and say, but we're going to use an individual assessment for you, and that can help us establish progress for you individually. And that's kind of appropriate because in some sense, yes, you want the group to function together, and we'll get more into that, but you also want the individual to benefit in their own individual way. And so how you navigate both of those goals is going to be important. And using all the assessments that we've covered in class, that might be okay. I shouldn't say all of them because some of them are not appropriate for group settings. But you could give people individual assessments and say, where are we at today? Maybe that's part of your check-in when you get here and you're like, let's use a stress scale on a scale of 1 to 10. This could be the most, you don't have to have this on paper. The most basic sense, scale of 1 to 10. Where are you at today? How's your stress? Or how's your depression? Or tell me what's going on today. That's one way of doing a really informal assessment. Maybe you use a piece of paper, whatever it is. Maybe you have people sign in and do an assessment quick before they even get into the group. I've seen all those scenarios happen. So as you're thinking about how to assess, know that you can use individual assessments. You might include the results of that for people to talk about if you do check-ins, if that's appropriate for the setting. Or you say, this is privately for you. We're going to talk about this with your therapist later in your individual sessions, but just something to help kind of orient you to where you are today, sort of a grounding experience, so to speak. So I think I've covered most of that stuff. Group assessment is generally done with more informal self-report measures. So the reason I'm saying that is when we talk about things like the WACE, if you remember from a few weeks ago, the WACE is an intelligence scale. It takes a long time to administer. It's just not something that happens in group settings because it has to be administered individually. most of the longer assessments just don't happen in group format unless the group is specifically gathered for that. Like when you took standardized tests in high school or junior high or whatever, you went into the class that day specifically for taking that test, but most of the time you're not doing that. So routine check-ins, those informal rating scales, these are all really common types of assessment. Of course, I'll show you something later too that gives you lots of different options for assessment if you need it, depending on your agency or what kind of work you're doing. But more often I see people just sort of do this informal check-in stuff. Another point here, I don't have a lot to say about it, but because therapeutic bond is most closely linked with favorable outcomes, self-report measures can be used. So it doesn't mean that we have to necessarily be scientific and objective about all of these things. Because if someone says, I just feel like this is a really good day because of the way that people responded to me, that's because people are building connection, building rapport, and they're just getting the benefit out of it. And it doesn't really matter like if they're actually, because progress sometimes in counseling is based on a person's impression or their perception of progress, that can be enough. And that's the point I was making here, that we're still, even though we're in group and we're assessing different traits and qualities and all that kind of stuff, a person's therapeutic experience of the group is kind of really important. That'll come out here again too in a little bit. There are disagreements in the importance of therapeutic factors that exist between clients and counselors. So what that basically means is that the stuff that we work on as an individual counselor, I want to create a rapport with somebody. I want sort of like artificial attachment experiences. I want people to connect with me in real, authentic kind of ways. However, in group work, it may be that I don't connect with people in the same way. It might be that I want the group participants to have more of those experiences, and I sort of just facilitate making those connections happen, and then also setting the ground rules for them so that things don't get weird. We'll talk about some of the risks of group work too. So some counselors think, yes, it's absolutely crucial that I'm a part of this group and I go in and I create relationships with everybody. And others say, no, I want to get to the point where I've made connections with the members and not me. So just in terms of what factors exist, we'll talk about some in a second here too. Group assessment is often done with members. So here's what I mean by that. You might have an individual client and they have their first 45-minute session with you, and then you go to write the assessment and they're not really involved in that process very much. You just sort of write it on your own. And they don't really get to hear anything. They might read your report later, but you don't necessarily walk through all the steps with them and like tell them everything that you're going to write. However, you could, and some of the I think most interesting, or at least my favorite, and this is my personal bias, my favorite kinds of group assessment are the kinds where you'll hear about these training centers that have somebody who has a group there and they're sort of a trained facilitator, or they've been doing it for a long time, and there's a glass window with a bunch of students behind, and then after they're done, the students will come out and sit with the facilitator of the group. The clients will go behind the glass and they get to watch the students talk about the clients and sort of be a part of that assessment, be a part of understanding dynamics of the group. I think that sounds really interesting. It also holds us as counselors to a standard of making sure we're not, you know how like sometimes you talk about people differently behind their back? It's not really that helpful. It helps us avoid jargon. It helps us avoid complicated language. It helps us avoid things that, to be curious in times when we could be judgmental. I saw the way that that guy looked at that lady. Instead, it could be, I thought I picked up on a look that that person gave. I wonder if that made sense, if that was what they were intending, or if that was really what I could, how I could interpret that look, or what. It just creates a different dynamic. Does that happen often in practice? I kind of doubt it, but wouldn't that be nice if we could do those kind of things? The other thing is it helps clients really understand, like hearing about where people are at and where they're going. When we talk about stages of group development, what stage are we in and where could we be going? That could be really helpful for them to know too. So there's benefit in really bringing clients into where are we at in the process? If we're trying to get up here, what's keeping us from getting there? Why are we still stuck in this place? What's going on here? And that can be a really valuable thing to do when you're talking with people in terms of like getting benefit out of counseling. Just a quick story. Gotta watch my time here a little bit. Just a quick story. It's for me, both in my classes and in counseling, one of the things I really like to do, because I think that has value, it really challenges people sometimes, and they don't like this because it just is uncomfortable. But sometimes I'll do this where I'll say, there's a few of us here who really seem like we're ready to get going, and sometimes get kind of annoyed with those who are not ready to not opening up and not really joining the process. So what is this all about? Who thinks they're ready? Who wants to do the work, and why are we not getting there? And so then we'll have people talk directly and openly about the conflict within group, which is really stressful for people sometimes, because they'll be like, well, I don't want to call anybody out for not being at the working stage and being ready, or I don't want to call anybody out for really sort of stifling conversation because it's uncomfortable to do that. It feels like being judgmental. And on the flip side, people don't want to be the one who's holding the group back. And so it makes it really uncomfortable. But when it works, depending on if I choose the right time and help facilitate it well enough, when it works, it really helps move the group from like kind of getting to know each other, not sure if they can trust everybody, to, oh, that's why you're in that place. I can have more empathy for you now, and why you're not showing up, and why you are kind of grumpy. But that doesn't mean that I can't still do my work and still benefit from this. And it really helps people kind of orient to what's within my control, what's without my control, and what can I expect of myself, or am I constantly be thinking I can't do any work here unless that person changes, which doesn't really help. So it helps facilitate those kind of conversations. So anyway, getting a little bit of ahead of myself here. This last link, I just want to orient you to that. It's a school program that I found one time that has a very formalized process for students as they are in college. I think it's most specifically related to substance use in college. But they have a bunch of different forms that they use and different parts of the process where they're doing different assessments throughout. And I thought, if anybody needs a template, that's great. If they want to see some of the assessments that we're using in practice, how that looks, you can go check those out too. So kind of interesting stuff. I'm not going to dig into it right now, I guess, but okay. I kept saying like, we'll talk about this in a minute. We'll get to that in a second. Now we want to talk about those group stages. What does it mean to be at a stage initially? Imagine your first day of class, and you come into class, and pretend it's your first class in a program, or like you're an undergrad, so you don't see all the same people. And you go in there and you're like, okay, I got to pick a chair. I'm going to sit over here because I always sit in the back, or I always sit in the front, or I want to be close to an outlet so I can plug in my computer, or whatever your thing is. And you kind of establish your zone, like when people sit down, we're creatures of habit. And so we kind of go to the same places, or maybe you're like me and you're like, I want to sit next to new people from time to time. So I'm going to move around the classroom. It's going to bother everybody. But then I get to meet people because I'm less uncomfortable meeting new people, and it helps us all, whatever. These are kind of the group dynamics, right? Like the people sit in their spots. We start to learn about who's going to be the kid who sleeps through class, who's going to be the person who asks all the questions. How are we going to function? So this is sort of like it's part, I guess I'm getting a little ahead of myself. It's part of that initial stage, but pre-group is kind of formation of the group. Now, let me take a step back for a second. This also includes, as a counselor, if I say I want to run an anger management group, I have to decide how many people can I handle, what day of the week are we going to meet, how am I going to, if most of the people I'm anticipating having in this group are going to be working professionals, do I need to do it after hours? Is it going to provide the most access to the most people to do it at this location or another one? These are all like the administrative questions that we get to ask ourselves. And there's going to be a list of other questions to consider in a bit here. But we have to sort of establish it. Are we going to use a curriculum and have worksheets and have like a set process? Or is this going to be more of a fluid, dynamic group that I get to facilitate week to week, but I'm not going to have expectations of certain kinds of work or a certain goal that we're going to go for? We're just going to provide support. And if people get that, then we win. We're doing what we're supposed to be doing. So the pre-group is partially that formation of the group, but I also include kind of blending the two first ones here. The initial stage is like getting used to people and figuring out who's in the group and who's not in the group. By the way, sometimes you'll have groups where you want to keep certain kinds of people out for very good reason. If you have a group for pregnant mothers, you don't want a guy who's a single guy come in, because he's not going to get it. Like, it's just not going to make any sense. If you have a group for people with depression and somebody comes in and also has bipolar disorder and starts creating divisions within the group, you might have to ask that person to leave because they're hindering the progress of others. So there are reasons to keep people out, and those are important considerations when you're in this pre-group stage. Who's in, who's not in, and then all the other technical details too. That initial stage then, it's both when, like I was explaining earlier, who sleeps in class and who asks all the questions. It's both when people are orienting themselves to the group dynamics, but we're exploring also the social norms. Like, what is it normal to do here? What kinds of things are we going to talk about? So we're talking also about, it's day one. You know how in classes when we all read the syllabus on the first day? It's because we're establishing our expectations for, here's what I want from you. Here's what you want from me. Here's what you're going to get from me. And also, is there anything else that we can do to make this work? So when you're, one of the things you'll get comfortable doing eventually, or hopefully you'll get the experience of doing this, is you may have to say, you know, here's my informed consent speech. It's private except in these circumstances. But what do you guys think private means? Does that mean we should be talking about each other outside of the group? Does that mean that we should be bringing certain things about personal relationships into the group? You know, how are we going to navigate this? So part of it is I get to set expectations, and part of it is the group sets expectations for themselves. And then we have to remind ourselves, oh, remember we said we weren't going to do that at the beginning because of this reason? Now we're doing it. Do we want to keep doing this? Is it healthy for us? Is it helpful? And so you can have those conversations later. But that's just establishing social norms, sometimes on purpose, and sometimes they just happen and we observe them from the outside too. So that's the initial stage. People are not working on their stuff. They're just sharing and kind of feeling out, who do I trust? Who do I like? Who's going to like me? Who's going to be the problem? Who's going to be a barrier? All that kind of stuff. Ideally, we want to get on to the working stage where we're actually doing the productive work. However, we haven't really talked about what it means to be productive yet. So there's this period in between, okay, I've been here for a day or 2 or 3 days. We've had a few class periods and I feel kind of settled. Like, I'm in the routine. I understand what's going on, but we're still kind of in transition because we're not fully understanding what does it mean to be, for each individual participant to really be working on their stuff. Because sometimes people come into groups and they're like, I want support, but I'm not really going to tell you my stuff. And I'm going to, what's the right word? It's not coming to me. But when people try and offer their support, I'm going to create excuses for why I can't help, I can't receive it, or I can't do the, follow your suggestions, or I can't do something differently. So a person might say, I want support, but then when they get it, they reject it. Those kind of things happen. And it's kind of this transition stage between actually doing the work that people come for, and I don't know, just sort of like not doing the work at all. So the transition stage is interesting because, and keep in mind too, people can fluctuate in and out of these groups all the time. If a new group member comes in, sometimes that creates new dynamics that people have to reorient to. If it's a long established group and if people have been doing it for a while, sometimes that happens a little quicker, sometimes not. Sometimes people can have good weeks where they do a lot of really good work. This week I shared a whole bunch of stuff that was really, really hard for me, and I felt a huge amount of relief. And other weeks I don't talk as much and I let other people do their thing. Or I'm just going through a period where I'm being a little more protective, something like that. There's all kinds of reasons why we can fluctuate in and out of these stages. The challenge for us as facilitators is figuring out, where are they at? Where, if a person is doing incredible work individually, where's everybody else doing? Are they just waiting their turn because they're really respectful and they understand the process, but next week they'll get their turn to do their work, on themselves? Or are they just sitting back and not saying much at all and not really benefiting for it? When do we call that out? When do we notice that? How much openness and honesty do we allow happen in our group or encourage to happen? These are all questions that we get to answer for ourselves. So ideally, what we said earlier is we all want people to be at this working stage, right? Like, wouldn't that make sense? The faster you can get people working, the better off you'll be. The question is, what does working look like again? And what gets in the way of that? That's something that we're going to continually talk about a little bit here. And we're going to leave a lot of open-ended questions for discussions later on and for you to learn these things later. Because it's one thing to say, like, yeah, people should come, show up, and do the work. It's another thing to say, like, what does that actually mean? I have a few hints, but I'm going to save it for just a little bit here. The last stage, which we haven't covered yet, is the final stage. It's saying, okay, we've had our 6 sessions. Where are we at? What did we learn? We know there's an ending point here. It could be somebody is, there's not a time limit that they have to get things done by, but they're like, I feel like I've really come to a good place in my life and I'm ready to be done. Well, what does done look like? Do you just stop going and never show up again? What about all the other people that might miss that person? And what about the chance to receive some feedback on what it's been like to be a participant in the group? Sometimes these things have really great value, provides closure, provides finality. And so all of these tasks that we've been doing here, summarizing, meaning making, terminating, all that kind of stuff. One of the things I like to do in my classes, and you'll probably see this if you watch class recordings, is at the last day of class, I like to take a little bit of time, reserve time to say, how has this been for you? What's the whole semester been like? Let's just do sort of an overview recap. What'd you learn? What was surprising? What was interesting? And just let people say whatever they need to say. Same thing in groups. One of the things I love to do, I've led mostly groups that have an end date. I haven't led like a lot of open-ended groups where people just kind of come and go as they want. So when I are leading up to that date, one of the things I'm often telling people is, we have 2 weeks left. I want to know in the week before the last one, what is it that if you had that 1 week to get done that extra thing that you've been kind of putting off, what would that thing be? Maybe think about it this week and come back for second to last week and tell me what that thing was. Or maybe we just come ready to do it. Or when we get to the final week, we think about, if you were to do this all over again, what would you do differently? How would it have happened a little differently? What things could you have controlled that would have made the experience better? Just like there's a million different kinds of questions, but they really help people sort of put a final bow on it and say, oh, I'm in the mental space of being done. I'm not leaving thinking, oh my gosh, I need to keep going. Or I'm not leaving thinking, I'm a failure. I didn't complete all my goals. So we get really a chance to put some of that to rest. Doesn't always work perfectly like that, but it is a really important consideration when you have that luxury. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes people just stop coming, and that's just what it is. That's okay. But okay, let me show you. There's another. I'm not going to call it an acronym because it's not an acronym, but it's a mnemonic device. Because of, it's also not called alliteration. There's another word. Alliteration is the beginning sound of every word is the same. There's also another one. Maybe it's just rhyming. I guess this is my English literature training. The rhyming here is a mnemonic device to help us remember basically the same slide that we just looked at, which was Gerald Corey. I didn't mention who that was, but Gerald Corey is a guy who writes textbooks, and he's really renowned for his training of counselors. The previous slide was his group stages. Forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. You'll see some crossover here, so I'm not going to go through all these in great detail. But forming is the same thing that we just talked about, the development of the group. Storming, he talks about this one slightly different. When he talks about group, he talks about it more, and also there's another guy, Irvin Yalom. Let me show you a book here. Here's another one. We'll talk about this in a second, but this is like a classic, hopefully you can see that a little bit, the classic group counseling textbook. And both this, I don't remember where this is taken from. I forget the names of the authors who developed this, but this and the Yalom book, both of them talk about these hierarchies of power that develop within any kind of group system, families, cultures, whatever. And so when they say things like jockeying for roles, what they're talking about here is who is going to be the person who looks the best to everybody, who's making the most progress. Or sometimes the jockeying is for who's suffered the most and who has the most traumatic history. And so people are really trying to like establish some place, and it's like a pecking order, if that makes sense. Sometimes that involves who has the eyes of the favor of the teacher or the group facilitator. Sometimes people really want to have special attention from certain others. Maybe it's romantically interested partner. There's a pretty lady in the group, and everybody's sort of, all the guys are like, I want her to give me attention. Or maybe it's from the group facilitator, whatever. All kinds of weird things happen in terms of like who likes who. I'm not sure if it's in the video sample that you're gonna see of this guy, Irvin Yalom, but he asked questions like, who are you most attracted to? Not romantically, not sexually, but who are you, like the person, when you think about the group, who's the first face that comes to mind? Because maybe you want to have a good impression in their eyes, or maybe you're really interested in them because you could relate to them somehow. Through questions like that, you can understand a little bit more about, do I really want to impress them because they kind of look like my dad and I have this stuff going on and that really will help me facilitate my work, that I'm not here to impress my dad or that guy because he looks like him? Or am I here to sort of let me do the work on my own? Or am I here for the wrong reasons, which is to gain the attraction of that woman over there or that group facilitator, and I'm willing to walk on anybody to get there? Those really help uncover motivations. And so that jockeying for roles, hierarchy, status, that's what we're talking about there. It's just sort of working through, how do I get to a place where I can get focused on my own work? And here's where I want to make a little comment on, what are we actually doing in the group process? I'm going to skip forward to another slide in just a second that'll help give us some more answers to this. But one of the things that keeps us from being able to do sometimes, these are just a couple things actually, but one of them is, some of us get really self-conscious about the way other people think of us, right? Like we want to be impressive, or we don't want people to think poorly of us. And because of all that foresight about what we can get people to think about us, we do a lot of impression management. And impression management just means, I'm not doing this for my reasons. I'm not loving me and appreciating me and caring for me the way I am, and trying to be self-corrective about that. It's because ultimately I want somebody else's favor or approval or attention or something like that. And so one of the things that can get in the way is, as we're doing all this storming, we're looking outward and we're saying, who are all these people? And if they change, I can change. And I blame them for me not making progress and all that kind of stuff. But really, when it comes down to it, each one of us is responsible for our own growth, right? Sometimes there are real things that happen outside of us that really stifle our ability to. But understanding the balance of what is in my control and what's not really helps us get to the process of doing our work in our way, even when there are barriers outside. It's like, okay, I can't help that one, but I can help this one. And that's me doing my work. So when people are outwardly focused on other things, we forget to look inward. And that's one of the barriers to like actually getting to the working stage. So this storming process they're talking about is establishing, okay, yeah, I understand that guy looks like your dad, but what can you do about it? I understand that you want to be attractive to that lady in the crowd, but whether you get her attention or not, you're not here for that reason. You're here for another reason. So how much do we spend our energy focusing on her, getting her to like you, versus what you're actually working on yourself? Which ironically, ladies, correct me if I'm wrong, but wouldn't you love a man who just knows how to like work through his stuff as opposed to be attractive to you? I guess there's a balance of both, but nevertheless, maturity is kind of one of those important factors, in addition to rock hard abs. We'll just say it that way. And for some of us, we don't have the luxury of rock hard abs, so we just have to try and be mature, I guess, sometimes. I don't know. We'll see about that. Anyway, in addition, when I talk about the group leaders in this storming stage, another thing that can kind of get in the way is it's really common in the group process for people to have this transference, countertransference, And sometimes the word for transference is projection. In other words, when I was talking about this guy who said, you look like my dad, and I'm projecting all of my dad's qualities on you, so I want to impress you, or I don't want you to judge me the way my dad did or whatever, that's projecting my own story onto other people. It's normal for people to get frustrated with their group leader for challenging them, or blame the teacher for doing things a certain way, for not teaching me well enough or something like that. And there's definitely some responsibility that leaders and teachers have to make sure we're meeting standards. School is also an opportunity for you guys to learn. You have the textbook, you have the resources, you know what chapters are assigned and what the standards are based on the objectives of the beginning of class. Now that you have that, it's kind of on you to pick it up and how much you can soak in and how much is reasonable to soak in the time that you have. So it's really trying to figure out when people get stressed, sometimes you guys blame me as a teacher. Sometimes as teachers, we can look out at you. I really try to protect myself from this, but it happens to everybody. I look at you and I'd be like, well, she's not doing her work, or she didn't show up. Ideally, we would understand in context why things are happening and have empathy and also set some expectations appropriately and all that kind of stuff. But this jockeying for status, some of that, the conversation about projecting and transference, and then how we respond to our clients, all of this is part of that storming stuff. Figuring out how do we establish getting to the real work. And if we're blaming the teacher for not doing it enough, or the group leader for not facilitating well enough, we're not doing our work. If we're blaming clients for not making progress, we're not doing our work, right? So somewhere in there is, how do I take in, even as a facilitator, even if people are being stubborn and difficult and ridiculous, what can I do about it? And that's what we want to get in the mindset of as counselors and group facilitators is, this person might not be making progress for whatever reason. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, am I doing what I can within my power and the way that counselors function to help them get to that next step? Or is there more? Is there more that I can expect from myself, or just different? Maybe that's another word, just another way to say it. Okay, I've been dwelling on this because this is really kind of at the core of what we're trying to understand a little bit more. So I'm trying to give different examples and caveats and that kind of stuff. The norming stage is really not that dissimilar to that sort of transitionary period, but maybe just a little bit beyond that transition period. The performing, same thing as working. Adjourning, same thing as termination. So those ones are pretty basic, but just a little bit of differences in the middle there too. Now, one of the things I just said a few minutes ago was we want to know what the work looks like. Ultimately, it's what are the barriers to getting there, but ultimately we have to know, like, how do these things function in a way that's functional? Like, you can feel it. If you're emotionally in tune, you can feel when a group is just gelling, man. When they're vibing, everybody's like, wow, what a special group of people. And I really feel like we're connecting on a new level. But as counselors, what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to say, oh yeah, and I can see why you're not, or what's going on here. And I also know what it looks like to get there, so we can facilitate getting there when other people are just like, I know it when I see it, but I don't know how to do it, man. It's like that kind of thing. Maybe I'm being a little bit curmudgeonly here, maybe a little biased, but I do think a lot of people go out into the counseling world and they have no idea what it means to follow the process through to the steps of getting to the working stage. It's just sort of like, well, if I show up and let everybody else sort of talk, hopefully they'll get there. And that's part of that is normal. If you're at that place, you're like, oh yeah, because I haven't learned yet. And you may not learn by the time you get out of the program because you haven't really been through enough group process or group experience to really understand thoroughly the pathway. And that's okay. That's totally okay. But ultimately, we want to get to that place. So let's talk about this. There are more factors than this, but these are the big ones. Installation of hope. If you have any of those groups, a support group, a group based on diagnosis, a group based on demographics, whatever it is, if there's no belief that this can actually work, that things could be better, then it's really hard to paint a picture that something is possible. We've all felt those hopeless times in our lives, and the installation of hope, if present, is enough to say, I'm not feeling good this week. but next week I can come back and gain benefit from it. I've been pretty hopeless about the people in my life, but you guys seem different. You seem like you're going to care in a different way. And so I'm hopeful about this being something good for me. It's just one of those factors, one of the ingredients. You can't make bread without yeast, sugar, flour, whatever. And if one of them is missing, it's really hard to make the right kind of bread, right? So installation of hope is one of those factors. Most people get that one on an intuitive level. Universality. This is one that doesn't make intuitive sense necessarily. Universality is just basically shared experience. If I come and I say, well, my parents were divorced, and you come to the group and you say, well, I had parents that were married, we might look at each other and be like, well, you're not going to get it. One of the things that I mentioned in other classes too is there are certain groups that really have a hard time benefiting unless you've had shared experience. If you've never been an addict, you're not going to understand what it's like to have cravings, what it's like in the hard nights. If you've never been a veteran, and you don't know military culture or what it's like to be in war, you don't get it. If you've never been a woman, you'll never understand what postpartum depression is like. There are all these different sort of things where we're like, if you've never been through, if you're not in group, you're not going to understand. However, the process of universality is trying to build in common ground. I may not understand what it's like specifically for you, but I've had experiences too that really hurt, and I've been to that dark place. Just an example. Or, oh, you like cheesecake? Me too. We are people that love cheesecake. We just built a social connection, whatever the thing is. So universality is very intentionally and specifically getting people to make connections, to sort of start liking each other or liking talking to the other person because it provides some sort of value to them. Just as a sort of moment to say, here's how that works. One of the things that I do as a teacher and a group facilitator is I try to make connections as often as I can. If I ask a question, we're having a discussion, and someone over here says like, I really think we should do X, Y, Z, and someone over there says, I think we should do X and Q. I say, oh, you guys both mentioned the X in there. What do you think about that? And so I'll intentionally link people together based on comments that people are making. And over a while, what you'll see is people making glances over to the same people because you're like, we're of the same mind, right? Like we have this in common. And sometimes I'll very intentionally pull in people who aren't connected and say, seems like that's kind of the same thing that we talked about last week with this, with Jane's story, because Jane was mentioning this too. And you were pretty quiet last week, but do you remember what she said? And then I asked Jane to repeat the story. And then all of a sudden, Jane and this other person are talking to each other, and they are making those universal connections based on shared experience. So that's kind of how that can look in facilitation. Imparting information. This is kind of like the psychoeducation. Sometimes we as a facilitator just have to give people information. Remember those expectations that we set for ourselves last time? This is the research on this topic that I think it might be helpful for you to know. Here's a tool that I can tell you guys that's really going to help you regulate your breathing when you're having panic attacks. Sometimes we just have to share stuff. And also, as facilitators, we don't have to feel like we have to teach everything, though. Sometimes it's information imparted by group members to each other. In other words, the simple way to say it, if no one's talking, no one's learning. No one's going to make growth. So there just has to be an element of, there has to be some content going around. This is where if you set expectations well and clearly in the beginning and the group really jumps in and starts sharing, then you have stuff to work with. That's really helpful. Altruism. Altruism as a word basically just means well-wishing. I wish you well. I want good things to happen for you. Instead of the opposite, which is be like, I don't really care about you. I don't care if you burn up in a fire tomorrow. I don't want things to go well for you. However, in a group space like this, there has to be a sense of, well, it's one of the ingredients anyway, there has to be a sense of, I want things to go well for you. I hope things go well for you, because ultimately when I'm going through a hard thing or I'm doing my work, I want people to say, you can do this. I wish you the best. I care for you enough to give you my attention and time, and that has to be there in order for group work to actually work. So if you see people just sort of nodding off or not paying attention when somebody else is doing their work, they're not getting their altruism from that person. It's just they're not adding to the pool of support. That's the idea. Interpersonal learning, hopefully that's pretty clear by now, that we're really connecting people and we're learning together and learning from each other. One of my favorite things is asking people, what's something that you saw today or heard today that was valuable to you? And oftentimes you'll get somebody be like, well, that story that John told really highlighted something that I want to do in my life, because I'm not, I've been spending more time on my phone and less time with my kids or something like that. So that's an example of like that interpersonal learning stuff. The last part is a little bit controversial. This book, I think it's in its 4th edition that I have anyway. It could be even more. And I think it was first written in the 60s maybe. So it's aging. It doesn't say here in any way that I'm going to find really fast. Yeah, I can't figure it out. But it's an aging textbook. And so the things that were happening culturally in the 50s, 60s, and 70s are different than modern America. And I think there have been people who take beef with these problem patients, so to speak. And I'm not going to spend time on all of them, but you can imagine this kind of person in different classes that you've had. The monopolist, the person who just takes over, always has their hand raised, always has a question for everything, likes to talk, doesn't ever shut up, and they just take over so much that those of you who are a little bit more reserved and could appreciate a little bit more think space before people jump in and talk, you don't get a chance to talk if someone else is like, well, I know the answer, I'm going to tell you, and I have my problem this week, and I'm going to share it. And if the group becomes all about one person, then it doesn't really work, right? So part of the facilitation process then is making sure that everybody gets a chance. You might have to stifle somebody a little bit to say, well, we just need to make sure that everybody else gets enough time and has their opportunity for input. Sometimes I've said that out loud of like, your stories are really important and they're really good for us to hear, but there's been a few other people who've been pretty quiet. I just want to make sure we give space for them to have the opportunity to talk if they want to. If they don't want to, no big deal. I'm still going to encourage them to probably, but we need to have the opportunity at least to do that. Other times, I'll just use nonverbal cues to people. If someone's talking and someone's chiming in, they're always interrupting, whatever, I'll just put up my hand and just say like, I'll put up my hand and point to the other person and say, oh, what was that thing you said again? And then I'll look over at them, and sometimes that's enough to help with these kind of things. The silent person. The silent person is one who comes but does not impart any information. And so other people sometimes forget that they're even there, sometimes want to know and they're curious about them, but without sharing information, we just don't know. Sometimes they're scared, and giving them space to really come out of their shell and challenge their insecurity is enough. But it's problematic because sometimes it can freak people out and that person's not going to benefit from it. So there's all kinds of reasons why the silent person can be problematic. The boring person, I'm going to say person because we use the term client, group member, patient, whatever, it doesn't really matter. But the boring person is somebody who has a story, but like they don't seem to be changing. Their problem is never getting any different. It's not getting worse or better. And they just droll on about the most mundane parts of their life, and other people just start checking out. And if they're checking out, they have no hope this person's going to improve and that their relationship is going to impact this person. And there's no shared experience. They're not imparting any information that matters to anybody. So like it starts killing off all these other factors when somebody is just like blah, 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 blah. And that can be one of those growth moments when you say, you know what, this is hard for counselors to do this, but you say, I think we've heard this story before. How many times in your life have you felt like this and had this sort of experience over and over again? Because in me personally, and I think I can see it around the room, is that when you're sharing this story, I want to connect with you, but I'm not sure where and I'm not sure how. And so that can bring up opportunities for, well, I'm not sure how you can connect with me either. And then we can kind of work through like, well, how about this? And we, depending on the context, you can hopefully help that boring person break some of their routine and help others jump in and join in to really connect with them. But it usually challenges that person's sense of some sort of comfort zone. That's been my experience anyway. The help rejecting, pretty self-explanatory. Problem, 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 problem. And people try and process it with them and provide some advice or suggestions or whatever. And they're like, that's not going to work because, or I've already tried that because, and all kinds of answers come out of that. But a person who's just not seeing the possibility of growth. I've done that, I've tried it, it's not working, whatever. I got to speed up a little bit here. Psychotic patients, pretty self-explanatory. If somebody is not sharing the same reality, it's going to be very hard for them to make human connections in a way that facilitates growth. Universality is hard. Imparting information can happen, but it's just on a different wavelength, kind of. So, characterologically difficult patients, that one requires some more time, and I think I'm going to skip over it for now, but just imagine some personality disorders. That's what we're talking about here. Also, just different kinds of people can be characterologically difficult. You sit me in a room with a bunch of accountants. I'm like a touchy-feely kind of guy. I don't do so much touching, but I definitely have the feels often, you know? I'm okay crying in front of people. I'm okay talking about my emotions. I'm okay making emotional decisions. But I've been around groups of people who they want rational process, and if it doesn't have data and fact associated with it, we're not doing it. And so I'm like, okay, I'm going to be the bad guy in the room here, and they're going to be like, ugh, you take too many risks. You should think this through more, and that kind of stuff. So, and then borderline patient, of course, too. Okay. How much more do we got? Oh my gosh, we're way behind. I talk too much. As far as screening, here are some helpful bullet points to help you think about, I mentioned this earlier, now we're getting to it. Help you think about, how do I establish a group? What does it mean to prepare getting into the group? So this is like that pre-group stage where you're putting together your professional disclosure statement, which would require a little bit of explanation, but I'm not going to go there for now. What's the purpose of the group? What are the policies? What are the expectations? There's a whole bunch of stuff here that you can read through these and say, if I have to establish a group, this might be something that'd be helpful to have available to me. So here's a question. I kind of already covered this one, but is it a good idea to screen for appropriate members? The answer is yes. This can be a hard thing for counselors sometimes, because we want to be so inclusive. We want to let everybody in. But just like in a graduate program like this, there are some people that if we let them in, they would stifle the advancement of everybody else, right? Like if we're going back to teach undergrad basics, we may not be able to teach the people on the other end who are like, I've been through psych undergrad. I even went through another counseling program of a different kind, but now I'm here to get a license. And so I've heard this stuff a million times. You don't want to bore the people who are performing. You don't want to go over the heads of the people who just are not there yet. So for that reason, you might decide to create some criteria on like who's ready and who's not ready. Or it might be appropriate to say this is an all-female group just for good reason. It might be appropriate to say, if you're not able to manage your condition up to this level, this is not going to be the best place for you, something like that. It'd be also like putting a healthy person into a psych unit where there's all kinds of different active, manias, psychoses, all that kind of stuff. They may not find that to be a very therapeutic environment, although it's what those other people need at that moment to stay safe and to sort of contain the difficulty that's going on in their lives. So yeah, screening is important. It can also be very challenging. The other caveat that I'll leave to that is that sometimes people prefer to write policies and procedures to avoid the difficulty and the challenge of making choices. They say, if we set it up, then I can blame the policies, and so I don't have to make a choice to say, you know what, you are not ready for this. Not one of them is not better than the other. Policies are very important to help you make those decisions. It's also important to be able to have the maturity and strength and capacity to say, here's my professional opinion. My assessment of you is that this is not going to be a beneficial group for you, or you're not keeping the group in a place where they can benefit from it, and so I need you to step out and do a different thing, something like that. think about that in context of you and where you're growing and how you're learning and your style and that kind of stuff. Because you might need to get better at writing policies, just needs to be a thing, or you might need to get better at telling people, I'm the professional here, I make the choices, and I get to say what works and what doesn't, or what's working and what's not working. I get to do that sometimes with you guys, where I get to navigate this thin line between saying I'm the professor and I'm supposed to know who is meeting standard as far as going into the counseling profession and who isn't. But I also like for you guys to give me feedback on, where do you think that line is? Who do you want your peers to be? What do you think people need to know in order to get in this profession? What do you think all the people who have already been in it for 10 years, what do you think they know? And how do they set up teaching and education standards so that we have guidelines to go through and like kind of walk through that process of who knows best here? Sometimes I have to say, I'm the professor, I make the calls. It's just the way it is. Other times I say, you guys get to tell me where you're at. And that's just something you get to navigate through too in your group work. This last one, members, clients who cannot adhere to group rules threaten the effectiveness, confidentiality, and emotional safety of other clients. This is one of those where if you set your expectations up well in the beginning, adhere to them throughout, it helps immensely the process of correcting and adjusting when people get off base. Someone has a conversation outside of group or they meet for coffee. If it creates some jealousy or some like gossiping or something, if that can be addressed as something we agreed not to do in the beginning, then it's just going to be a healthy reminder. Or it might lead to dismissal of somebody in the group. But if there is somebody who's doing that and is threatening a part of the group, it's going to be sort of an infection until it gets cleaned up. It's going to be problematic. So that's another part of your process of how are we making progress? We're making sure that we keep good boundaries so that infection doesn't get in, something like that. Okay, almost lastly, genograms. We've been talking a lot about group assessment. We've hardly talked about family assessment. Family assessment, as I mentioned in the beginning, is largely related to the interpersonal dynamics of family members. And there's all kinds of stuff to know about this. But in terms of assessment, some of you have heard of these before. Some of you even like had some practice with them. But a genogram looks very similar to a family tree where you see grandma and grandpa and they had this baby and now there's dad and dad got married to mom and mom now had me and my sister. It's like, that kind of thing. But instead of just saying who gave birth to who, it's who comes from who and what kind of relationship do they have. The genogram is really trying to capture family patterns in terms of interpersonal dynamics, also family patterns in terms of like alcoholism, trauma, sexual orientation. Like there's all kinds of interesting details you can learn about people and the way their families are structured based on a genogram assessment. These things can they can be pretty simple at face value, but it's like learning a different symbolic language. It's not terribly complicated, but it does take practice. But once you learn that, as you're doing an interview with somebody, you can say, okay, tell me about dad. So you write your little square on a whiteboard or something or a piece of paper. And it's like, well, my dad was married to my mom, and then you put mom in there and you marry them with your lines and you say, well, what was their relationship like? Was it strained? Were they close? Did they love each other? Were they codependent? Like, what was the nature of it? And then you use a different set of symbols to sort of explain that. One of the things that can be really helpful, especially in terms of like looking at childhood traumatic experience and that kind of thing, big T or small t, depending, is when you see patterns that somebody is displaying in their adult life, like, my husband, we get along, everything's fine, but we lost our spark, and he started hanging out with his friends, and now I go shopping with my friends, but we've lost our luster. And you say, like, well, tell me about your parents. What was their relationship like? Well, they didn't really see each other that much, and they had this independence. Both of them were voraciously independent in life, and they did all their own things. And so I guess I never really had a model of what it looked like to come together, but now I'm feeling kind of lonely in my adult life, and I want a little bit more connection. So I don't even know what that looks like. And you're like, oh, well, we can learn a lot from your parents about what's going on now and the things that we need to pick up that we never did when we were kids. So that's just a a really basic example, but a genogram can help you facilitate that understanding of the process. On D2L, there's a YouTube video of, for those of you watching online and don't know what D2L is, it's where all students get their information. There's a link on YouTube. There's lots of stuff all over the internet about finding what a genogram looks like, and you can sort of look into this yourself and see what they look like. And in fact, let me show you a resource. If I can find it fast enough. Here's a book that I was given in college, and I never did read through this, and it's on my list of something to look for later. Here's the authors too. I always wanted to read through this and learn this system. I just have never been able to do it, but this is like kind of one of those books I think is pretty well respected in the field. So if that's something you want, you might want to pick that one up. It's not, I don't think it's too expensive on Amazon or something. I think just for the sake of time, I'm going to skip over these last points. You can read them there, but for the most part, I've kind of talked about those. Okay, so admittedly, there's not a lot on genograms, not a lot on family assessment, but that's such a big topic that I think would require a lot more time and investment. So hopefully, what you have here is somewhat valuable. I guess there's one other thing in terms of family assessment that I can tell you about contemporary counseling practices. I've heard people ask about what are the best trainings to get good with working with couples, and maybe even extension of couples as families, because couples with kids and parents and that kind of stuff. The Gottman method. So John Gottman is a guy who's written books that are bestsellers, and you'll find people who aren't counselors who are just people who know about John Gottman. He's got a training institute, and his books, my wife and I have read some of them together and sort of worked through some of it too, and I find them to be really valuable, and he's really well respected, well regarded. So if you're looking at doing some family or couples work, that's something you should get familiar with. Potentially even a little bit more popular and more well respected within the clinical community, not just sort of like the pop psych kind of community, but EFT or emotion focused therapy. It's kind of this new thing. I'm blanking on the name of the lady who really popularized it and who's kind of the forerunner of it. The name that's coming to my head is Marsha Linehan, but she was the sort of founder of DBT. I want to say it's Sue Johnson. I think she's kind of the one credited for developing emotion-focused therapy. So if you look up one of her books, which I don't think I have, I think it's at home, the one that I have. Emotion-focused therapy is really well respected, and it's a good model to learn and understand if you're going to work with families, particularly couples, but families too. And then, of course, anything you look up as far as systems theory, you're going to hear about a lot of different people who are who've done some amazing stuff. Another person, if you like YouTube videos and TED Talks and that kind of stuff, who kind of comes from that tradition, and also you can hear it in her podcasts, is Esther Perel, just kind of like a popular person right now. If you look up her name, she's got a really thick accent if you can understand it. But if you listen to her podcast, she has real people come in and she talks to them about their real conditions. It's on a podcast called Where Should We Begin? She's got another one called How's Work? And in those podcasts, you can really you can hear her doing her assessment with people and understanding from this family perspective, an emotional perspective too. How did you get this behavior in adult life from that stuff that came before? And then you can watch or listen to her sort of do her work with people in terms of personal discovery and making changes that could happen, that kind of stuff. So some great resources out there, but unfortunately you'll just have to sort of do those on your own time, your own work. Just looking at the last final thoughts here. I think we've already covered this stuff. So I think we'll just sort of end it here. We're a little bit over my general 1 hour timeline. Hopefully that's not been too annoying for you guys. So thank you for listening. For most of you, this sort of designates the end or the last lecture you get from this class. So I appreciate very much having the opportunity. For those of you that have made it to this end point, I appreciate very much the opportunity to share these things. I used to be really, this is my signing off moment, but I used to be really anxious about teaching. And I was like, I'm never going to be a teacher. That sounds terrible. I was so nervous to talk in front of people. And just public speaking is freaky, you know, and talking on camera is weird. And I was talking to somebody who I trust, and I said, well, you know, presentations they freak me out, and the idea of standing in front of people and teaching sounds terrible. And he's like, well, tell me the good news. What kind of good news do you have? And I was like, well, I really think it's important for people to know about this. And he's like, well, you just taught me something. Now do that. In other words, he was saying, encouraging me to share the good news. And so whenever I get to do these kinds of things, both as a counselor and a teacher, I feel like I have the opportunity I've learned about all these wonderful things. Here are some skills that you can be prepared for. Here's a way to think about this thing that'll help you function in the future. Here's an intervention that you can use with other people to go out and do your good work. Whether it's with clients or you guys as students, to me it feels like I'm just sharing the wonderful things that I've heard from others or these resources that I picked up over time. And so it really gets me kind of excited and helps manage my own anxiety and awkwardness kind of to be able to say, I'm just giving you the good news that there's hope for you to be a good counselor. There's hope for clients' improvement. And here are the resources that we have available to us to help facilitate that. It'll take more work because we got to get good at these skills and practice them over and over again, but it's possible. So I'll leave you with that hopefully moment of installation of hope. And I will just see you when I see you. All right. Bye, everybody.